Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. Glad to have you along again. Thank you, Mike, for joining me. And we are now jumping finally into the book of John. And may I say, if you haven't listened, this is the kind of text or story where I would say if you haven't listened to the previous podcast, you need to in order to understand how I'm going to be handling and working with John 1. So if you can do that, let me mention, in fact, as we start, Mike, good to talk to you again, by the way. I was just listening to a short, I guess, video of Mike that someone had posted, and he was being interviewed about academic world and comparing that to the world of the church. And in vintage Mike fashion, he complained about being in a church or two in his lifetime where he was presumed to not be smart, or that the pastor didn't want to get into a certain subject because he felt it would be too deep or something like that. And Mike's main point of this little interview was, don't underestimate the power of your people. They can think just fine, and it made me, in fact, let me give you an idea here, Mike, and you bounce off, because you're a pastor more than I am. I mean, I was a pastor, and I enjoyed much of that role. The one thing I didn't enjoy was that I couldn't demand that my audience follow, week to week to week. In other words, you always had visitors, and you didn't, you always had to presume that your audience was a first time. There's someone was in there that's there for the first and only time. Mm-hmm. Which to a teacher can be frustrating, right? Because you can't then take the group on a path of knowledge. You have to keep starting and stopping and starting and stopping. And here's my analogy. I don't know if we've talked about it before, Mike, but to me, the modern church, and here's where I sound like Dr. Heiser, my complaint, I think, might sound a little the same. When I go into a church, and whether it's by the introduction of the pastor's sermon where he'll say, "My name is Bill, and I'm one of the pastors here," I sometimes say to myself, he's backing up. He's presuming that everyone here, or at least most of us, are first timers. Because think of how a church, here's my main point, Mike, and then you can bounce your thought off this one. How come the church tries to act so different from all other organizations? When I go into the grocery store, they don't presume I'm there for the first time. That's not how they're made or built. When I go to my club, let's say it's the model railroading club. I don't have one, but let's say I went to one. We wouldn't presume that everyone who's there always gets treated like the first time visitor. Now, there might be one, and we're glad to have him. But the main point of that time we're together, whenever it is, we're dedicating our time to the people that have been there for a while, right? You're thrown into the deep end, and you're talking about parts of model training that probably are years in the making. And I, as the visitor, would not be offended by that. In fact, here's my point. If I go to a model train club, I don't want them to treat me like I'm a first-time visitor, even if I am. I want you to get into the nuts and bolts of model training and make my head spin. That's why I came. And I don't want you to back up and start over as though that's helping me. If anything, it hurts me, as even the newcomer, to be treated like a newcomer, because then I realize this is going to happen week after week after week, and I'm probably going to stop coming. And that's my point about church life today. A lot of times I get the feeling that we think we're honoring the visitor by starting over every week. I sense that the visitor comes and goes and doesn't care to come back because he realizes he's never going to get very deep. What do you think?
I would say I agree, yes, and also I would caution, because how can I say this? Like, I want to honor our time, but I also want to make sure that I explained as well. Like in my context, right? Because I'm a part-time teaching pastor at my church down here in Quincy, and that's been the very thing that I have always kind of advocated for and pushed for, which is, let's go a little bit deeper into our scriptural study during the sermons. Let's actually dig into the text, and I believe our people can handle it. And I think in my cultural context, I am up in New England. And New England has been not just only postmodern, it has been post-Christian for many years now, for decades.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't even assume that people who come into the congregation that they have any familiarity with Christianity at all, like with even the lingo, because they may even be just foreign exchange students. They may be coming from a different culture or different place on the planet. Like our population in this area and in just the greater Boston wide area, it's so transitional. And I think that's part of the tension I personally feel, because we know who our regulars are. We know who they are. But at the same time, our church still stays around that golden number of 70 to 120 people per Sunday. And that number fluctuates in and out. And there's always still a good portion of that, fluctuating number that is new folks, a sizable amount of new folks. And so there's always that tension of how much can we go into? And I don't think it means that it's like a half-inch thick theology. But I do think the challenge for preachers and teachers is, how do you provide depth, but also provide the on-ramp for someone who is stepping into your congregation, maybe for the first time or maybe the fifth time, and that they can really just like catch on. They can get on board with the conversation. And that's the challenge. I think that's the modern challenge of preaching. And I think it depends on every different cultural, like every location is going to be different. Because I would assume in Michigan and in the church where you are, at, the population is a little bit more steady, right? Versus someone who's going to a church that's in the LA or San Francisco area or any major area where there's always a big transition of every couple of years, a big transition of the workforce or a big transition of people moving in and out. Here in Massachusetts, we've had population decline technically for the last decade, but we've had an increased amount of folks who come here as college and as working professionals. And even this past year, we finally had a population growth just because of the amount of migrants who've been brought into the state. But our population generally, from the steady population, those who are longtime Massachusetts folks, have been on the decline. And so like just even culturally, I get what you're saying. I want to teach deeper theology. I want to go into the text and really just flesh it out as much as I can all the time. But I also have to be aware that amongst those who are generally, yes, the insiders, those who are consistent, I have also a lot of people who are coming who are very curious and truth seekers. And I want to be able to help both groups and somehow create a ramp that allows the truth seekers to join in the conversation quickly. Yeah.
Well, let's use, in fact, last podcast and this one as a experiment on the ramp idea. Was last time enough of a ramp that we now can get into John 1:1? And after this hour, would this be the kind of thing we could do on a Sunday morning with an audience over the space of two sermons, and accomplish what we want to do in John 1. So that's how I'm handling this, of course, with a podcast audience. They can go back and listen. And so if today is confusing, that would be helpful. But let's see if this would be the kind of thing that we're doing today now together, would be something on a Sunday morning that people could handle. So, well, here we go. Let's look at John 1:1, and we're only getting through the verse. We'll, of course, speed up our pace as we go, but we are given a shot over the bow in John 1:1 that for centuries, of course, has made our academic and devotional minds spin, and that's good. So here we go. In the beginning was the Word. Now, in Greek, NRK ein ha logos, the word, of course, not capitalized in its Greek. It's just the word logos. that has caused a lot of conversation. And so for a DCW podcast like this one, I'm going to recommend, well, let me give you my opinion on Logos and then move on, because there's just so much that we could do, and I don't want to get bogged down on every phrase and every word. But this is a quotation from James D.G. Dunn, Christology in the Making, a New Testament Inquiry into the Origins of the Doctrine of the Incarnation, 1989, second edition. It just shows, I think the first edition was 1980. This has been a while. This has been around for a while. This kind of conversation about, as I'm going to quote here from Dunn, has been around for, a generation. And so it's not new. Few, if any, passages, talking about John 1:1, have been so influential on subsequent theology, for it was the Logos concept, the explicit affirmation of the incarnation of the Logos, and the identification of Jesus as the incarnate Logos, which dominated the Christology of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Quick point there. If we were living in the 1st century, the world of Jesus, for the 1st and 2nd centuries, we would have heard a lot it seems, putting everything together, and again, I'm summarizing a lot of academic work here. In the 1st and 3rd centuries even, you would have heard a lot about Jesus being the Logos. And we don't, that was pretty much appended and put on the shelf after Nicaea 325. Then it became the conversation that Jesus is the Son. And so Son Christology, we call it, in shorthand, pretty much replaces Logos Christology. And don't let that frustrate you. That's just the move of history. Again, history moves in fads and in rhythms. And Logos discussion has basically, since the 3rd century, been set, not aside, but it has not been the main way we think of Jesus. It was at one point. Now it's more, we think of him as the Son of God, and we have much more conversation on that. Let me keep reading. On the one hand, Logos Christology was central in early Christianity's attempts to explain itself to its cultured contemporaries. At the same time, the central thrust of John's prologue, the Word became flesh, injected a new and unique element into that dialogue. The point there is that Philo and pre-Jesus writers among Jews, and especially among Greeks and Romans, the idea of Logos in Greek, that word, had a vast array of meaning in the philosophical realm. And the idea that there existed a reason, capital R idea, that existed as a demiurge or a separate deity even. And think of the idea of wisdom in Proverbs 8, where it's she, and the writer of Proverbs personalizes this word wisdom into a woman, and then goes on and talks about her as though that's a way of thinking of wisdom. So the point is this, that when you hear the word Logos in John 1:1, there was a host of thought about that word well before the reader would have heard it or read it in John 1:1. Continuing my quotation here. By holding fast to the affirmation of the incarnation of the Logos in Jesus Christ, patristic Christianity was able to maintain its distinctive testimony over against all other competing cults and systems. Here's his point, that the Logos becoming flesh was the issue. It's not, in other words, the mind of the reader wouldn't have been on what is Logos. The idea of John 1:14 is he became flesh. Oh, okay. Now we have something we can put our hands on. We can touch and feel and see. And that's how, of course, 1 John starts, that we have touched him, seen him, heard him. And it doesn't use the word Logos there, but the point is that what made Christianity distinct in Dunn's mind, as he's putting together his Christology over the course of this book, is not the word Logos as much as that Logos became flesh, because that had not been part of anyone else's, like in the cults and things like that. No one had claimed that Logos became flesh, and Christianity did. So one more point then. The background of the Logos concept and its use in the prologue of John's Gospel has been discussed many times, and the great majority of contemporary scholars would agree, and again, this doesn't prove it, he's just trying to summarize where people have been over the centuries, would agree that the principal background against which the Logos prologue must be set is the Old Testament itself. Bingo. And I like that. And Mike loved it. Dr. Heiser was all about that. This is what a DCW is about, that when you hear a word like logos and you I wonder what that means. Well, the best place to go is the Old Testament. True, you had Philo and others, and even Plato and previous Greek-speaking writers, things like that, deal with that word. But if I want to think biblically, and if I believe the Bible has a ultimate author to it, to some degree, I'm always going to think Old Testament first, and then move through the cultures that come, on the way. So Old Testament itself, that's important. And the thought of intertestamental Hellenistic Judaism, particularly as expressed in the wisdom literature. And that is probably where, and here's where, again, I'd be happy to get your opinion before we move off the word logos. Here we are, John 1:1. We've only gotten one phrase in and we're stuck, right? But here's where I know Mike and I discussed, and we generally disagreed on this one, but that's okay. Again, you can have a DCW. You don't have to agree with every other DCW person, including Dr. Heiser. And on this one, the identification of the logos, I think there's room for discussion, certainly disagreement, because it's such a broad concept. And so for me, what I take it to mean is that the personified idea of word, like in Psalm 33, Yahweh spoke and it happened. That Yahweh has this ability to say something and it happens. That idea is personalized, like wisdom itself, into a person who then can operate in a narrative, almost as though he appears and talks to people. And so the word of God came to Jeremiah and said, or the word of God came to Ezekiel, son of man, whatever. Samuel, the boy, 1 Samuel is at 4 or 2, somewhere in there, where he hears God, Samuel, and the word came to Samuel. I know that Mike liked to put a human being, or not a human, but an actual physical structure, a physical being in the room with Samuel at that point. I understand, and that's fine. We disagree on some details there, but the point is that the idea of logos to the writer or the reader of John 1:1 is caught in this idea that whatever this reason of God is, reasoning ability, word, logos, rationality. Some translator, he's a philosopher. In the beginning was the rationality. That's how he even translated John 1:1. But here's the point, 1:14, he became flesh. Whatever he is, or whatever it is, it became flesh. So any thoughts there again, I'm not doing great service to one word, but we have to move on. So,
well, I think, these last couple of years for me, it's been a little bit of an overhaul of just what I had assumed the word logos in Greek was referring to, like the rationality or the first principle, or however it was described in some Greek philosophies. And that, John is playing with Greek philosophy and basically trying to show to his Greek audience, hey, this is actually, now it became flesh. It was like primarily focused on Greco kind of wisdom and literature and philosophy. The last couple of years, I've been more challenged in maybe that the logos is actually from a Hellenistic Jewish, from a Second Temple period. Is it referring to another mental concept that is probably more thoroughly Jewish or more Hebraic in John's mind? And one of those little things that have been rummaging in my head space for the last couple of months, especially, has been about the Aramaic translation of Genesis. And, the Targums, which were basically the rabbinic translation, paraphrase, commentary, however you want to describe it, of the Old Testament. When the Aramaic version of Genesis came out, they didn't use, theos. They didn't use kurios for Lord. Instead, in Genesis 1 verses 1, it says in Aramaic, English translation of it from this translation, from the beginning, with wisdom, the memra of the Lord created and perfected the heavens and the earth. And memra is Aramaic for the word. And so I remember, both Dr. Heiser had talked about it before, that he thinks that the concept that John was playing with is actually the Aramaic concept, which was probably what most Jews of that time were more used to, hearing the scriptures spoken and taught in Aramaic, not necessarily in Hebrew, because of this is part of the ramifications of what happened with the Babylonian exile.
Right.
And so that Memra was maybe more of the concept space of where John was coming from. So a little bit of what Dunn is saying here, intertestamental Hellenistic Judaism. And later on, other writers like Israel's Lord, the Two Powers book that you and I had talked about a few episodes ago, that's also kind of an area where they dug into as well, about how the Memra is almost seen as a personification, as though an agent who seems to have connections back to Yahweh. Mm-hmm. And so anyhow, that's where I've been challenged more of late, that it's not just thoroughly Greek, but there's also Hebraic concepts that are being played with. And probably John is playing with both, because of whoever his audience is listening or reading this, he's playing with both sides, because there's this interesting ambiguity that's happening with the word logos. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you. As we get to 114, we can let that go and say, now we have him. Now he's on the ground. Mm-hmm. Whoever the logos was, now we know where he is. So we'll get there. Let's move to the next phrase in our three phrases of John 1:1. And the Word was with God. Every version I've seen in English that I'm, on my shelf has that for its translation. And the Word, logos, capital W in our versions, was with God. There is an article there. Here's the Greek, kai halagos ein pros ton theon. So accusative, ton theon. The article is there. If you look up, and this is very general, so again for time, what's the difference between theos with the article in Greek, ta or ha or ton here, and without the article? Generally, again, putting a broad brush on this, but this is how the grammars handle it. Generally, when you have an article on theos, it is more specifically tying into a theos you know about in the context, and the application would be in English, the dad. If I'm looking at a group of men in the room and I say, that's the dad, well then, in other words, I'm singling one out from others, and then I can speak of that dad in various ways. The God, or I'm sorry, I really shouldn't say, and boy, stop me, Mike, if I ever say God. This is from last time. The word God is not in our Bible, right? It's theos here. So let's try to call it for what it is. When you have the title theos used in Greek, then when I see ha in front of it or the article, and the only way to find this, guys, is to have a logos program or an accordance program and just look it up. You have to physically do the work, because your Greek will not honor this anywhere, or hardly at all, in your translations. So look and see if there's an article in front of theos, and if it is, it likely is referring to a theos that you know about, the theos. If it doesn't have an article, it's not always the case. It's not always the case, but often the lack of an article on theos is getting more into the quality of what it means to be a theos. So it can even be translated, and sometimes is, as divine. In other words, what does it mean to be a theos? It means you're a divine being. So now you could just take the word theos without the article and just translate it literally as deity, divine, something like that. And again, it's not a capital D. You're simply taking the theos, theos, and thinking of the quality of what it is to be a theos. Sometimes you do have theos without the article, and it clearly is referring to Yahweh. In the story of John, throughout the New Testament, again, for sake of knowing Greek or reading the Greek, they knew when to put that article on, and even well-qualified Greek scholars today could not, and they'll admit this, in translating a text, they can't presume before they see it whether the article would appear in front of a title or not. It's just there's no ability for the 2,000 year later person reading it, even if they know Greek, to predict ahead of time whether a writer like John or Paul will put an article in front of theos or not. So we just have to kind of play with it as we go. But on this one, the word was with God. That's the English. In Greek, just realize the logos, ha logos, with pros is a Greek term, the or ha theos would be the way it looks. So here is, let me give you a quotation from David Capes, one of, he did a course at Awakenings, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is from his book, 2018, The Divine Christ. John's declaration that the Word was with God, there it is, John 1:1, implies individual existence, interestingly, distinct from God. Capes is making a good point here, that the writer seems to be saying, John, and we'll talk about authorship down the road. I'm not going to deal with a lot of introductory thoughts about John until we need to as we go through the book. I think it's better to handle it that way. John's declaration that the Word was with the God implies individual existence distinct from the being known as theos. So, reading on, Paul will later claim that Jesus is subordinate to the Father. Remember this in 1 Corinthians 15. The Son himself also will be subjected to the one who put all things in subjection under him, so that God, theos, there again in Greek, may be all in all. And the point that Capes is making is that when you read 1 Corinthians 15, the word theos there clearly is Yahweh, because it's being compared to the Son. So the Son would be huios in Greek. Theos there would be the Father in how it's being understood. Mm-hmm. Continuing on, clearly Paul regards the Son as subordinate to the Father. Similarly, the Johannine Jesus, the one we're reading now, will state later in John 5:19, very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing of his own, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. So Jesus will, in this conversation, in this part of Capes' book, page 157, he's just going through, in fact, this is the only, according to the table of contents at the end, or the index at the end, this is his only use of John 1 in the book. And that, in other words, he can't do everything. And so in his limitations, this is where he talks about John 1:1. He does so noting that phrase with God implies a distinction from Yahweh to some degree. He is with him. He's with the deity, with the theos. And so my translation of this, if I were to translate it or paraphrase it, I would just say it that way. And again, this is my paraphrase. This is not the translation. And the Word was with Yahweh. Now, any thoughts before I give you my what to do with this moment?
I mean, I know, like, a part of it is, so a lot of this is like at times when we do these podcasts, I feel like my mind is like split into like three different
Oh, I know. I can't imagine being you. I'm talking along and my mind would be exploding with, but what about this and so forth?
Because a part of me, like, I like, one, I understand, like, because, we did the whole entire two powers discussion episode. So I know where you land about two powers and is Jesus a second Yahweh? Mm-hmm. Do we want to go that way or not? And I lean towards the way of using Yahweh as the name to describe the triune God. Because to me, the word Yahweh is synonymous.
Oh, I see. So you'd rather put Father there? Would that be
I would,
a paraphrase now? Would you paraphrase it as Father?
I probably would just leave it as ambiguous as God, as a shorthand for Godhead. But that's just because in my mind, Yahweh is a synonym for creator, that it's the name of the creator. And so it's an interesting conversation, right? It's like, and I ended up following along with like the path of like Adam Wynn and the whole entire Israel's Lord book of what categorizes or what really distinguishes Yahweh. And part of their criteria that they came up with ultimately was, it seems to be Yahweh is associated with creation. and is creator, like the actual one who creates. And so that's why they came down to the idea that the second power is a second Yahweh, because the second power is involved with creation, is a creator, not just like, oh, I'm helping along, but actually is participating in the act of creation.
And okay, so can I ask you a question? And again, the beauty of our podcast is I don't know what you're going to say.
Yeah, I don't know what you're going to say.
and I don't, well, again, the beauty of a DCW is I don't know what you're going to say, and you might disagree with me, and you're still DCW, right? In other words, the tent of DCW is big enough to handle whatever disagreements or agreements we're going to have in the next 10 minutes here. Let me ask you a question then. And I'm honestly asking this because I don't understand how that works. When David praises Yahweh, literally, bless Yahweh in Psalm, 113, whatever. Bless Yahweh, praise Yahweh. Is he praising? Who is he praising? Is he praising a Godhead, or does he not know that he's praising a Godhead, or what's in the mind of David at that moment?
I mean, that psalm is also complicated because it depends on one. We're assuming that it's truly David who penned it.
Okay.
Second, I mean, I personally do think it is David. And if it is David, then he is talking about Yahweh. And however the mental space in their minds, they conceptualize Yahweh, they're thinking of one being. What's interesting, though, is that the whole entire discussion about second powers is that they apparently had no problem with the idea that there was a Yahweh in heaven and a Yahweh on earth, that there was a co-regency, but they're both Yahweh in the end.
True, but can I ask this? Was the Yahweh on earth subservient to the Yahweh in heaven?
And when you say subservient, do you mean that they are less than?
Sent by. In other words, doing the work of, representing, sent by, agency.
Yes.
Or were they equal in the, and I'm just honestly wondering here, because this is what I've always wondered about the two power view. Is the person who believes in that kind of two power thing, is he saying that the one on the earth is just as authoritative as the one in heaven? Or is he saying that the one in heaven sent the one to come to earth and is thus authoritative over him?
I would say, I would actually say that's probably like an and both, because what's interesting in that Adam Wynn book is that they bring up that, because the whole entire discussion about two powers usually begins around the 3rd century about Gnosticism, right? And because by that point in time, two powers had devolved essentially into this whole entire demiurge. You have a good God and a bad God, and like two dualistic forces, that kind of thing. What like Alan Siegel started the ball rolling essentially was this realization that there was more of a complementarian version out there. It was a minor view. It eventually just kind of got lost over time. But apparently during the Second Temple period, there was this complementary concept where you have these two beings, one in heaven, two persons, one in heaven, one on earth. And the one on earth is, yes, acting as though he's an agent, but at the same time, the one on earth is also receiving authority, respect, and even associated with the one in heaven as well. And so there's no clear dividing wall. And I know that, that we've talked about the concepts of representation and can this person be a representative? And I remember we even had this discussion about, the word of the Lord came, right? And that David is talking to a human being, but for David, it's the word as though he's talking to Yahweh.
Yeah. And we don't need to revisit that whole conversation. And I do recommend anyone who wants to go back and get it. Do you know what podcast it would be? Would it be the Genesis 16? I know we talked about the angel of Yahweh at that point and representation. That might be the place. Yeah. I'm not sure, but Just listen to all of them. But where do you find it? So, hey, thank you, Mike. This is why we're here, to spread the tent of DCW over, whatever view we're taking, and then realize within the tent we may disagree. So I know Mike and I did. I mean, it was, we'd follow each other through ETS, making fun of each other for our different views. And the beauty of Mike is that he could stand his ground just fine. And I could hardly convince him, toward my view ever on anything, including drafting Joe Burrow from my fantasy team. But he was gracious in his disagreements all the time. So and let me give you my opinion, and then again we'll have to move on. The Word was with Yahweh. To me, this would have been stunning. The idea that whatever the Logos is, and again, I'm going to find out in 1:14 that he became flesh. The fact that here's where this whole pre-existence concept comes in, and again, entire books are written on the not just the deity of Jesus, but the pre-existence of Jesus, because pre-existence by definition means now, if I'm following the Old Testament story of Elohim that are created, now I've got to change my vision, my picture, my schema of how to think of Yahweh existing forever. At least in concept, all of a sudden I have this jarring idea, and I think this is what 1:1's going after, that when I think of Yahweh, I've got to think of a second person there, a second being. I've got to, and maybe we agree on this one, that whether, however we're going to handle the second phrase, that Jesus and Yahweh both existed from the ages past. In other words, they're both uncreated. So let me say my point, and again, I'll let you respond if you think where I'm coming from. When I draw, here's what I did in my teaching over the years. When I was Old Testament, I would draw one cloud, and I have a dotted line, and then stick figures below the dotted line. And I would say to the class, think of this cloud as Yahweh. He is a uncreated spirit. You've never seen him. In fact, you can't see him. You can't, photons don't bounce off him into my eyeball. That's just not how he works. So you are dealing with an invisible, immaterial spirit who has been here before time. He's a creator of everything there is. And I only have one cloud. Then I have, of course, in my description of things as I go through a class, I'll bring in created Elohim. I'll draw smaller clouds below Yahweh. And they're smaller because I want them to realize monotheism means I've got one creator and many created. And then I draw a very thick line actually between the big cloud and the smaller clouds to just, again, reinforce the idea that there is only one creator. But my point is that now if I turn to John 1:1, I have taken my class, as it were, through the entire Old Testament. I've got one big cloud up at the top, many smaller clouds below, and then humans below that. Now what I'm doing within two phrases of John 1:1, I've got to take and put another cloud right next to Yahweh. And to me, that's the shot over the bow that we will have to struggle with, enjoy, love, and find out the relationship. Because now I'm going to wonder, what does this one cloud think of the other cloud? And we're not going to get very far before we find out 5 or 6 times in John that Yahweh loves Jesus. He loves him. He loves him. He's unique. In other words, there's just so many ways to define the relationship, and we're getting into that now, that's what will catch their attention. More than saying he's a deity, we're going to say he's with Yahweh. Whoa. So anyway.
So I think if I were to use your cloud, the illustration idea, right? Because the key phrase that you also mentioned was pre-existence, which is part of the definition in my mind of like what is creator, right? Because creator is the one who created things or other things afterwards, and so there's pre-existence. And so I guess in my concept, the way that what is shocking is that I don't see two clouds. I think of one cloud, but he's like pulling the cloud open a little bit of like seeing inside the cloud, right? Because typically when we see the cloud, we just see the big bubble of this nebulous thing that's like floating around.
Okay.
But I'm almost like imagining God that John is like using his hands as though he could open the cloud. And
well,
then
he'll do that in 118. Okay,
Yeah.
is that fair? And we're going to get to it, that Jesus is in the kolpos, or the lap, or the chest of Yahweh, or the Father, or whatever. So we'll get there. But yeah, that's interesting. Okay, yeah, you could, instead of having two clouds, you could have one cloud with kind of you'd have to be a good artist to do this, looking inside that cloud and seeing another cloud. Is that what I'm hearing?
Or just seeing, like, sure, maybe a cloud within a cloud. I mean, it's just, but it's, because the way that we're describing it, like, I'm trying to make it very clear. This is pre-existence, right? So this is before things were created. And so that's why in my mind, in my conceptual space, I do use the word Yahweh as the moniker to describe the being that was there before creation. And
is that okay? And let me ask you again, just to be clear. I don't know what you're going to say now. Is the word Yahweh necessarily Trinitarian? Can I stick the Trinity in the word Yahweh?
I think, depending on when and where we are talking about, maybe.
Okay.
But maybe not. Right? I think this is part of the whole entire trajectory of what we see the church wrestle with for the first 3-4 centuries of trying to conceptualize. Because, we talked about it last episode. We're entering into a world here where theos and theoi are just everywhere. And they're basically describing supernatural phenomena, supernatural beings, like, these even like phenomenon power that human beings see, such as earthquakes, thunderstorms, lightning, tornadoes, things that are way beyond what is the capability of a human being. And we see the early church is wrestling with trying to clarify, worship only one theos. And so which one? Don't look at everything that used to be categorized as theos as being worthy of worship.
Right.
And it's trying to define that in a world that is so confused, right? And that's what it means to be living in a pagan world, where they're trying to clarify it and try to prove to the point why this theos is so worthy of not just your worship, but your affections, your loyalty.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think, depending on time and place, maybe. I think when we get into this time period where John is writing with, and even with the concepts of idea of like Memra being thrown in there, of like, okay, even the Jewish people during the Second Temple period are curious about, who is this Memra? Like, why is that Memra in Genesis 1 in doing the creation when we know it was Yahweh who was doing the creation, right? And so that's what I mean. It's like, it's fuzzy during this time period. And that's why I think that cloud and just peering open.
I'm glad you disagree with me on this, because I want the tent of DCWism to be big enough to handle both of us. And I would be sad, actually, if we agreed on something like this. That is, I mean, this isn't small stuff. I'm not saying that. But it shows how challenging, I think, even to the first readers, and now even 2,000 years later, we're still struggling with. I mean, think about this, Mike. We're 2,000 years later, we still don't know who Jesus is. Isn't that amazing to me? I mean, can I say it that honestly? I do it in my prayer. I mean, I'm quoting Matthew 11 something, where Jesus says, "No one knows the Father but the Son, and no one knows the Son but the Father." So I'm kind of leaning into that verse, where I'm given the right to look into the heavens, even in my prayers, and say, "God, I wish I understood you. I wish I did, but maybe I'm me. I'm limited, and someday I'll get a lot more than I have now." But anyway, I just like the fact that we can notice that within a DCW there are going to be disagreements, and that's very important, I think, to the view, because once we get everyone agreeing on the same page, that can be kind of a problem. I'm ready for the last phrase. Are you? Here we go.
Can I mention one more thing? I guess maybe this might help explain just like maybe part of the difference, right? I came into Gordon Conwell, my seminary. It was in my essay when I was applying for the Doctor of Ministry program, and one of the questions they asked me was, what is one thing that had changed over time?
I like that
for you when you were in seminary. And so I answered it that, it was probably more into like, the mainstream pop culture, evangelicalism, like however you may conceptualize that. But I found myself in the end caring very much about, because I had one of my Hebrew professors, her family background was half Christian and the other half is Muslim. And one of the convicting things that she said once is, so often at times when she's in churches, she's noticed that they may say they're, for example, Trinitarian, but in practice and in speech and in teaching, they're very Unitarian.
Yes.
It's easy to do. That led me down, as well as like, this is also my beginning time of still learning about DCW and all this type of research and Second Temple stuff. I've come away with that. I really do emphasize for my own personal spiritual life, relationship with the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and not in a like a mantra way, but an acknowledgement that they're all intimately involved. And I may never fully understand them. I definitely won't understand them in my lifetime.
Right.
But they have all played some role and some importance in my own spiritual journey. And from what I can see in the scriptures, they are all intimately involved with the formation of what we see as the Old and New Testament scriptures. And so that's kind of where I am coming from. And that's just been an interesting thing of not just only incorporating New Testament theology, but understanding there's something going on in the Old Testament that the New Testament eventually just hatches out. It tries to bring some more clarity, especially in the world space that John and the other apostles were living in.
Yeah. Could I say, by the way, and I may have said this over the year, over our time together, that I have become good friends with. In fact, I've known him for 40 years, since our college days. But good friends with a Christian Unitarian, and by that I mean, and it's don't think universalist Unitarian. That it's not at all. A biblical Unitarian believes there's one God. His name is Yahweh, and that Jesus is the Messiah, but he's human, and he is not a deity. So biblical Unitarians believe there's one God, and we worship one God. We worship Jesus to honor the Father. And in other words, everything is kind of the same, except you would not put Jesus into a Trinitarian picture or model with Yahweh. And I know that's stunning to many Christians, and including when I heard it. I just had to wrap my mind around that idea that I wouldn't think of Jesus as a deity. And it's been interesting over the years as we've continued to talk, how, well, I'm not going to get into it now because of time, but how, again, he's a Christian. Many people would say you can't be a Christian if you don't believe that Jesus is deity. I do believe he's a Christian based on everything I'm seeing in his life and how he reads the Bible and worships Jesus. But he does it he does it through the lens of, again, Old Testament, that the Messiah, as promised in the Old Testament, was going to be a human. That's part of his thinking. And that Jesus fulfilled all of those prophecies. And so and I only bring this up is when I get into this kind of thing in John 1:1, he will look at this and say, the word was with Yahweh, but only as wisdom would have been. Or again, think of the word as a personification of something like wisdom, Lady Wisdom. Lady Wisdom was with Yahweh. To him does not mean there's an actual woman standing with Yahweh, before time began. It just means the idea. So there are ways to read this beyond what you and I would, as a way of not even making Jesus a deity. I'm not there, and I've told him that. So we often compare notes as to how even the deity of Christ would work in the teaching of the New Testament. So I just throw that out there, that some of you listeners may know of Christian Unitarians, and they're from what I read of them and listen to them, they're desperately biblical in trying to understand who Jesus is. They're not trying to run away from deity of Jesus. They're trying to honor what they think the text is saying about his deity. And to me, at least, they're on the same path that I am. So I'm ready to move on to the last phrase. And I don't think, we can handle it here. Obviously, this doesn't solve the whole book, but it is a shot over the bow, as it were, as we move into the rest of the book of John. And the word this is English, and the word was God. And the word, capital W, was God, capital G. In Greek, kai theos ein ha logos. And in poetic form, this is common for John in his gospel, even the gospelists, the synoptics. And in Paul's more poetic portions, you don't say it the same way exactly in word order. In Greek word order can be more fluid than English. So ha logos was with the theos, and theos was the logos. He flips, like chiastically, he flips the order of logos and theos. But the question is, what is the word? In other words, and the word was theos. And it is past tense, was. So how do we handle this? I have 3 points in conclusion, and with these 3 points, I'll make my case. And again, Mike, we're not, you know what? Let me say it this way. We're not settling. Well, actually, this is my first point. Let me read it. Jesus' deity, or deityness, or lack of deity, if you want to say it that way, is not the crux or purpose of John's gospel. Remember how the gospel ends. These are written that you may believe, John 20:31, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the huiou to theou, the huios to theou, the Son of God. And we're going to get into what a Son of God is as we go through John. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack there. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is, and think of, the countertext that could be there. A countertext in literary analysis usually means what you could have heard but you don't, or what you expected to hear but you didn't. And so a countertext can sometimes be a powerful way of just saying, notice what the author says to surprise you when you thought something else was coming. We don't know that this is a countertext, but again, just think of what he's saying. These are written so that you may believe, be loyal to an idea and a person. His name is Jesus, and that he is the Christ, the Christos, the Messiah. And I take the Son of God to be appositional to that. That's what we mean by Christ. And that by believing, you may have life in his name. So I'm not saying that Jesus' deity is not important. Don't read me wrong there. For reasons that we'll see in the book of John, there is value, incredible value to me. Again, I'm thinking of my Christian universal, my biblical universals, or Unitarian when I say this. To me, there's value in Jesus' deityness, and I am responsible as a human to appreciate and value that deityness as much as I possibly can. The question is, what does John do with that phrase? And halagos was theos, or the other way around. Does he make it an issue of salvation? I don't sense it there or anywhere in the book. And again, I long for your opinion on when I say things like this, Mike. Nobody, from what I'm seeing, except Thomas at the end of Jesus' life after his resurrection, says to Jesus, "You are my theos," right? Nobody ever says that. Thomas does, "My Lord and my theos," putting his finger in Jesus' side. Now, why then? Why there? Let's get there. And I'm not detracting from anyone actually having done it. Could Jesus have someone, or could the narrative have included someone coming up to Jesus after the Beatitudes saying, "Boy, you're God in the flesh. There's no way. I mean, the things you're doing, this is, that'll be, again, a discussion to have." But to say my theos in front of Jesus would have been a stunning point. Jesus, of course, we all heard this over our academic life. Jesus nowhere says, "I am theos." He never says that. Others will accuse him of being equal to theos. We'll have to deal with that when we get there. But so let me just leave it there. In any response, the third line of John 1:1 does not seem to be the crux of John's argument moving into the book. It's there. We're not supposed to miss it, but it's not the purpose of the gospel either.
I think, at times when, I think in general, a lot of the folks who would categorize themselves with like followers of Orthodox Christianity, and when I say that, I mean small o. There's always those capitals that it just messes up. Like, but I think there is that concern about, well, who do you think Jesus ultimately is? And what I do find, and you bring up that point about Thomas, I think narratively it is actually it's part of the narrative payoff of what John had set up in verse 1.
Okay. To
eventually you get the penultimate doubter declaring, my God. And since it's in the context of an entire narrative where we know from the very beginning of how, like, he's hinting at what he is meaning when he says theos. And then you finally have Thomas, who didn't believe. He doesn't trust what the other 10 are saying. And then he finally makes that declaration. I think that's part of the narrative payoff.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I think, like, he doesn't, Jesus is true. It is true. He doesn't say, I am Yahweh or I am God. He does say a lot of I ams though.
Right.
So there is also something going on with that, with wordplay. So I'll just leave it there.
We will, just for the sake of the listener, we will talk about the I am statements. There's a lot in John, so we will have to visit that. So, yeah. And I'm sorry if I cut you off. I didn't mean to.
Well, I mean, so I guess that's kind of what I would say is, I would agree. Yes, the purpose of what John's gospel was focused on was ultimately about people's loyalties, their allegiances to Jesus the Christ, right? Like that was what he wanted to help supply. Because even towards the end, the other line he mentions is that if someone was trying to write everything that Jesus had done, the entire world couldn't hold that library of books,
right?
And that everything that was particularly in John's gospel, it was craftedly and purposely chosen by John to help enhance loyalty, to help enhance allegiance.
Right. And the beauty of my first point is that you can have an Awana child. My grandchildren are just starting Awana, 6 grandchildren, ages 5 and under. And so they're going to be one by one now starting Awana. And you know what? I guarantee you they're going to have a bad Christology. They're not going to know who Jesus is. They're going to, say things that are theologically inept. I shouldn't say it that way because I love my grandchildren to pieces. But does God mind when a child thinks of God or Jesus in the wrong way? I'd say no. That's what it means to be a child. You can believe in Jesus and not have a good Christology. Mm-hmm. And I would recommend, this is me again, I will die with a bad Christology. I know I will, because there's something going on here that's beyond my mortal mind's ability to understand. So I don't want to minimize who Jesus is. I desperately feel bad. This is my personal opinion. I feel bad if I ever think that I'm thinking less of Jesus than I should. Okay. And I'm sure you do too. However, I also say at the same time, I have a bad Christology. I just know I do, because my facts are just not lining up with what the text seems to be saying. And that is because the text is difficult. The philosophy of what it means to be a theos as opposed to a human sometimes is just difficult, right? So anyway, I'll have to move on. But
I think it's fair to say, Ron, that you and I both, I would readily acknowledge not only probably our Christologies, you or I, are not accurate or as fully fleshed out as possibly, but I would also just readily acknowledge my fatherology or my pneumatology is not as fully fleshed out as possible either. It's like,
right. Yeah.
Like that this is part of the process of living in life and having discussion, is trying to expand and help grow our understanding. And so I would agree with you on that point, right? We are, as much as we try to be clear, we are never going to be perfectly clear.
Wouldn't it be fun? This is one of my dreams about the afterlife, is that we get to go to heaven and God gives us a choice. You can either go in that room and find out the truth, or you can go in that room and be given 1,000,000 years to read all the books you've ever wanted to read, written by humans and written by God. Read the Bible and know Greek and Hebrew backwards and forwards. And you get 1,000,000 years to improve your theology. Now, which door would you take?
if we're talking about after like corporeal life, I would probably choose the first door.
Yeah, I probably would too. But boy, there's something about that idea of, obviously there's Oreo cookies available. You get to drink Dr. Pepper and eat Oreo cookies while you read all these books. See, so there is a payoff. But no, the point is, are we going to learn it all immediately, or do we get to learn it in heaven? That's, I guess I'm going with the latter on that.
I think heaven itself will have more than enough time, and whatever we think time is. I had an interesting conversation this past week with another friend about just even what the concept of time is. Mm-hmm. And, I think this is a little bit of going into what I'm probably going to be talking about in the next few weeks in my own church. We're getting into like the larger grand story of Scripture. And this is my personal suspicion. Whatever was happening towards the end of Genesis chapter 2, of what God was doing with Adam and then with his wife and everything with like the naming of the animals, I think that was just the beginning of what he had intended his image bearers, his imagers, to be doing. And Genesis 3 was an interruption to that story.
Oh, okay.
That it essentially interrupted the training that he was wanting to do. And
okay.
I think that by whatever it means that we hit with the eschaton or the consummation, that storyline from at the end of Genesis chapter 2, I think it's going to continue on.
Fascinating. Yeah. Well, that's a fair view. That would be fun to see how that plays out.
This doesn't mean that this story that we are living in right now is unimportant. It definitely is. But I think it's a deviation from, it doesn't throw God's ultimate designs and plans, whatever he was working on, out of whack. He can pivot. And this is probably one of the biggest pivots we can ever think of.
That's a pivot.
Of like, okay, I'm going to take care of this wayward creation, and we're going to make sure things are good. And then so where were we? And then continue on.
Interesting.
That's how I imagine it. Is like, yeah, I would so love to see what that story was.
And I have another friend who likes to talk about that too, in the afterworld being, because he's into science and AI, and he has so many broad interests. And his point is that he wants to see the world run right.
Yeah.
And, extract energy from the earth in a way that is sustainable, in the sense that maybe oil and gas was our way of getting to where we are, but God knows there's a better way to do it. And that someday maybe we'll be able to figure it out. And his thought is that the afterlife, the new creation, of course, the new creation will be an extension of this one, in the sense that God will then show us all the things we were missing all that time. And that we'll be part of that creative process of learning how to split, the atom in a way that now we can live by its power, so forth and so on. And that's another way maybe of expressing your view with an intent of how the afterlife can be pleasing on a very academic and informational level. Yeah,
I think the typical way people have always thought about, like, one Earth goes away and a new one is like comes into place. I think that's definitely more figurative language of
that is not the fad Earth. Now. As far as fads coming and going, the new creation being an extension of this one is very in vogue. N.T. Wright has that view. I know that many of those who like to read N.T. Wright have been moved by his thoughts there. So, well, I got to move on here. And this is my second summary point about the last phrase of John 1:1. And that's this: a DCW, a divine council worldview. Here's my opinion, Mike. Finds Jesus to be theos with the pre-understanding that multiple theoi exist. That's what it means to have a DCW. I believe that theoi exist. Plural, right? Yeah. So Jesus can be a theos without any theological problem lurking around the corner. Now, and let me just defend that quickly and then give you your shot. The reason people don't like 1:1 ending with, and Jesus was a theos, and then translated as a God, is because we don't like small g gods. They are offensive to our theological system. They imply a createdness that the Jehovah's Witness will do. He'll translate that as a God. The Mormons will translate it as a God. And then they will move Jesus down a rung into the level of a created deity, blah, 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 right? And so what the Orthodox person has traditionally done, and you can pick up a boatload of books on Christology that do this, they'll say, well, it can't say Jesus is a theos and translate that as a God, because that means ... You're going the way of the Mormon. You're going the way of the JW. My point is, hold the fort a second. Wait. Let's go back and remember what a DCW does. It gives us this ability to think in terms of multiple theoi that does not offend the story of the Bible. Because again, you can have a created theoi, and again, Satan will be called a theos in 2 Corinthians 4:4. So you can have multiple theoi and not offend monotheism, right? We've already established that. We did this last time on our podcast. My point is then, why couldn't you just translate that as, in the beginning was the Word was with the God, the theos, and the Word was theos. He's a deity. He's deityness, if you want to put the qualitative aspect on there. So what do you think? I mean, why can't we just say Jesus was deity and let it go with a small d?
I mean, so I think there's a little bit of also, in my mind, what's going on with John is that he's doing a polemic. Right? He's pushing back against the common Greco-Roman assumptions or the Hellenistic kind of mixture that's in Hellenistic Judaism too. And I think I'm still more comfortable with just deity with capital D or a capital G, mainly because I want to make the theological point. Jesus is better and just trying to be very purposeful in my communication. You got to start rethinking how you thought about all these supernatural phenomenon, these supernatural beings, these other created beings. I want you to think of Jesus in a completely different way, in a different, start shifting your mind away from the old concept and get into what the community has been learning and just getting excited about. So that's where I would say that you can do that, but at the same time, you risk that whole entire confusion because unfortunately, a lot of people like the proof text. And I think there is that need to be very purposeful in what we suspect John is trying to get at, right? What he's trying to elevate about who Jesus is, who this Logos is.
Right. Would it be fair to say back, and I'm just thinking of how the average, the response back to your statement would come. To me, it would be, well, why didn't John do that then? In other words, he has the word theos in hand. He hands it and he gives it to Jesus. So Jesus is theos. Why didn't he? Well, I agree with you, but can we wait a little bit longer in the story to find out exactly, as you just said, this is a different kind of theos than we're ever used to seeing. I would agree with you. Jesus is a different kind of theos than any other theos. Yeah. How that is true will come up in the story.
Right. And this is part this is part of a longer conversation about just the art of translation, because this is the tension, right? You and I are discussing the tension. We want to honor what we think John is trying to get at eventually, especially when we get into the later parts of the story. But at the same time, there's also this, we want to be also very honoring to how the text is.
Right.
But there's that always that tension, because you have what is the wordage there, but then I also can see how that could be so confusing if he were to use the article, for example, right? Because all of a sudden, then are you then saying, oh, we got some sort of phasing in of identity of, here's, I'm going to wear the mask of Yahweh, then I'm going to wear the mask of Jesus, and then I'm going to wear the mask of the Spirit, right? If he uses an article with theos, then you get that whole entire confusion that's going on, because now you're just thinking about one being only. And it goes into what scholars would call a strict monotheism, which is what modern Judaism is, and also what modern Islam expresses, is a very strict monotheism. The Second Temple period, I mean, from Alan Siegel to Daniel Boyarin, and then to like Adam Wynn and his co-writer, like the concept apparently during the Second Temple period was that there was this, it was just a monotheism, sure, if we want to use that word, but it wasn't strict. That they were not insistent on limiting in the line of pre-existence that there's only one person, one being, and that's how it's defined. And
yeah, there was a conversation, to be sure. Yep.
Yeah. So
okay,
it's a tension.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm hoping our listeners are somewhere on our wavelength of at least understanding where we're both coming from and feeling out where they can fit into and start the conversation in their own head that's going to last for years. So my third point, should I get to that one? Mm-hmm. And it's kind of by extension where we were just going to, Mike. What a DCW, in my opinion, cannot do, because it just runs contrary to our whole point of why we have a divine counsel worldview, is to create on the fly a new meaning of theos that did not exist for the writer or reader. In other words, here's the problem that I would say openly, even in a large group of Christians. I would say it this way. I'm not against Trinitarianism. What I'm against is grabbing a word like theos and turning it Trinitarian when I want to. So what I'll do is I'll say in this last phrase, Jesus is not just a theos, he's part of a trinity. And the way I'm going to do that is give you the word theos. And we treat the last use of God in John 1:1 as a Trinitarian word. It includes Jesus, Yahweh, and the Spirit. That's what we mean by God, capital G-O-D. Mm-hmm. What I'm against is saying that you can do that you can take a word like theos, which is not capitalized, and it doesn't have in itself, lexically, the meaning of the Trinity, and just put it in there and say, well, what John meant was he's Trinitarian. I would say, well, John could have said that, but he didn't. He said theos, and I'm stuck, because of my DCW, I'm stuck with the text. It might make me uncomfortable, but I have a whole book to read to find out who that Jesus is. And all I have, here's my last point, and I'll let you jump in. All I'm saying is that Jesus is called in this text a theos, which I'm expecting. I'm now wondering how he relates to the Father. That's going to be my question coming out of John 1:1. How does this theos, who is Jesus, relate to Yahweh? I want to know that, because I'm thinking this book is written to believers in Yahweh who want to believe in Jesus, right? That's the ultimate goal here. I'm not taking an atheist and turning him into a Christian. I'm taking a loyalist to Yahweh and presenting Jesus to that loyalist and saying, you need to worship Jesus as a way of worshiping Yahweh. So, and I know that gets confusing and complex and all that, but that's my worry on number 3, is that we use a word like theos and turn it into a capital G-O-D and then think Trinitarian right off the bat, when John has not had any chance to describe it that way. And he's probably never heard of the word theos in a Trinitarian sense. That was never on his radar. So what do you think? So
I guess, Ron, I would say it this way, right? I understand the concern that you have about this point number 3. And maybe then this is a little bit of my own pushback that I even alluded to with the Dongalos discussion we had. I think when we have the time to explain it this way, it's not confusing, right? It's like what we're trying to do is flesh out the concepts with the limitation that John had at the time of his writing, the words that he had available, and the lexical meaning, the semantic meanings that were available at his time. He couldn't use words like Godhead or Trinity because they didn't exist, right? Like he couldn't.
I know.
And so, but one of the things is, again, like language does evolve. And I get our tendency a lot of times is to bring our cultural and modern ideas of of modernity and import that right into the text. And so I agree with you 100% there. We need to be very careful and push against that. Of like, this is part of the whole entire training. This is the whole part of doing the research, is to get our minds into this world more often whenever we're reading it in this time. The same time, I feel the tension of, I also want to make sure I explain things clearly to the modern person who already has, unawares to them, 2,000 years worth of evolution of language, evolution of how words are. And that, you know, as much as I may disagree with how a certain word, for example, that used to mean happy primarily is now used to describe something else. I have to accept that when I'm addressing an audience that may be coming from that background, that when I use that word, that's where they're going to come from. Right. Yeah. And so I feel the tension. I think the thing that is probably more helpful is if we were to go back and explain the concepts, right? We don't just use the shorthand Trinity and then don't even explain, like, where does this word, what is this word trying to describe? And what is it trying to grab at? The concepts from the actual scriptures that it's trying to grab at, that the early church even had tried to use to explain.
Right.
And so it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of responsibility. And I think that's just part of, like, I feel the tension and the angst, right?
Yeah.
And because we want to be very accurate with our wordage, but at the same time, we're also dealing with words evolving.
Yeah,
all the time.
Yeah. So with that, let's go back to our original question that we started the conversation with this time, was if we had a church service and we were given 2 hours, 2 separate church services, right? 2 Sundays, for the preacher to stand up and say, I'm going to talk about John 1:1. The first service, I'm going to talk about theos and what that means in the Greco-Roman world. In the second sermon, I'm going to talk about John 1:1. Do you think we would do our audience? Is this the kind of stuff that our audience could handle? So, they don't know Greek and Hebrew, but they are interested Christians, right? What do you think?
So like a full 2-hour service and is primarily just about preaching.
Well,
I mean, if we're caveating it that way, then yes, we could probably have enough time to be able to explain all that. I think it also comes down to, do you know your audience? Right. And knowing the level of your audience and making sure that we're shepherding them well and helping explain along the way and trying to even predict, right? Like a good preacher is also focused on, like, okay, how are they going to react when I use a certain word? How are they going to react when I use a certain phrase or turn of phrase?
Been there, done that. I know what that means.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think, yes, if we give ourselves enough time, or even, it doesn't have to be a full 2 hours, break it into like an 8-part sermon series that's half hours each, and do quick review every time you do a sermon. Right.
As soon as you said that, I thought, yeah, but people wouldn't come to all 8. That's the problem. So
I know, but that's always the tension, right? People come in and out. That's why we have recordings now. Thank God.
Yeah. And that's why we have podcasts now. So you can go back and listen to the previous one. Hey, Mike, right. I can't thank you enough. This is a good example to me, as we close up today, where the DCW is at its best. It's two guys, in this case, having coffee, love the text, love the God of the text, and want to know what's going on. And both of us still agree we don't know everything, and yet we can agree and disagree along the way, and do it with grace and compassion and love. So that's what it's meant to be. And you are a good example of it in my life, and I appreciate it. Let's let it go. I will and invite everyone back for next time. We're going to have to speed this up. We're not going to take the book of John one verse at a time, but we'll divide it into sections and move it through with this question in mind: who is Jesus? How does he relate to the Father? How does the word theos, work into that? So we got a lot to do. It'll be fun to do it with you, Mike. So until next time, everyone, God bless, and we'll talk to you then.